All right, everybody, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's conversation further and deeper. And in today's episode of the podcast, we are actually flipping things around and doing an addition that we'll probably do many times into the future. But instead of our normal host, our lead pastor, Buck Giebelhaus, we are flipping it around and interviewing Buck, because there are going to be plenty of things where you are actually the expert on things. And today is very much one of those topics where I just get to quiz you and kind of put you in the hot seat. And so hopefully this is fun and exciting for people. So Buck is here with us. You got yet another jacket.
I do.
Fun. You've really become a jacket man recently. Over the course of the summer, too, which is interesting timing to become.
I know. It's way too hot to wear jackets in the summer.
Yeah.
But I gave an explanation to that.
Yeah.
So I feel. But this jacket is, the reason I'm wearing this is because I'm a little, I was cold.
Yeah.
And
that's why people wear jackets usually.
Yeah, that is why.
So
sometimes there's fashion statements.
Yeah.
But because this morning, I was sharing with you before the podcast how, I did the workout thing and my,
Which you've been doing a lot. People have been noticing. People have been commenting on social media. They've been really.
I know.
Happening.
Yeah, I'm trying, but
It's been impressive.
I had some success early on this year.
Yeah.
And then I lost that success, some of it, and now I'm trying to get back. It's like, hey, this is for the children. my children.
Your children, to
My
be
children.
around for a long time for your children.
And I've said before, it's like
Thank you for clarifying.
It's a gift. It's a gift for Jill. It's a gift for my kids, and so I'm trying. But I was working out early today, and I was like super, my core body temperature was like really high, and I felt like it wasn't coming down.
Yeah.
And so I drank like 4 gallons of water.
Yeah.
And now I'm freezing. So that's why I have this jacket.
On a serious note, I am proud of you for prioritizing health. I know you've been trying for a long time, and you've had some successes here, which is really cool.
Thank you.
And on a less serious note, I am curious what people think about the jackets on Sunday mornings.
I don't know.
Because Edel and I, we've just been reflecting. Like to us, we've given our really candid opinion, which is more or less that we think it kind of screams midlife crisis, and we're not sure. But other people seem to really like it. So
you know what matters to me?
I don't know what you're going to say.
Jill.
That's good.
Jill. And so she's like, hey, I like
she
the
likes
jacket.
It. That's all that matters.
Change it. I wear these, longer sleeve button-up shirts, and I like those too.
Yeah.
But then when I threw on a jacket, I think, those times in your marriage where, she just looked at me different. And I was like, I might as well buy 2 of these now.
This is good.
Yeah.
This is good. I told your son last night, I told Luke of your 5, I told Luke that he is making me feel old, which is an interesting new sensation for me, but that you make me feel young. So it's interesting how that kind of works.
You're sandwiched. We do that for you, Jordan.
Anyways, we have important things to talk about today.
Sure.
Hopefully helpful things to talk about. And we have kind of a just very straightforward pointed question, actually, that we want to tackle, which is specifically, was Jesus political? And we're in the midst of this series, Red and Blue, the way forward with politics and religion. And that is kind of an interesting question, because typically people like to keep those two topics very separate to oftentimes very highly emotionally charged topics that people don't want to come up around, the dinner table, the Thanksgiving table, or something like that. And we've been going right at both of them in the course of this series. So I'm wondering, just to start our time, if you could summarize what part 2 was about just a couple days ago.
Yeah, so part 2, we just jumped in to a very specific tension that I think as followers of Jesus Christ, and I try to be very clear as a follower of Jesus Christ, that's who I was talking to this in part 2, that the tension is, are we going to put our political filter ahead of our faith filter? Or are we going to be known as, hey, here's our political views, political stances, here's all your political positions, and do you go to church? It's like, and so I said, how can we be known as a Christ follower first? And then all of our political things, which are so incredibly important, second or third or fourth or, kind of down the road.
Yeah.
So I gave a grid, and hopefully it's a really helpful, practical tool to go, okay, as we move into this really polarizing election cycle and future ones, how can we make sure that we are known first and foremost as followers of Jesus? and how do we make sure to see our politics through the lens of our faith?
Yep.
And so hopefully it was helpful. It's been helpful for me. So
yeah, it was helpful for me watching. It was challenging for me watching, just thinking about how easy it is to put, whether it's a celebrity or, college professors I've had, books I've read, and just what certain people think about topics or issues or policies, and to really think like, have I started at each of those with the law of Christ that you talked about? I thought, I loved it. So I think a lot of people are going to find it really helpful if they haven't watched it yet. But
cool.
I thought that was great. I think, specific to our question, then, to continue to build on it, is Jesus political? I think a starting point for that might be to say, well, how would you define political? Because that's an interesting word, right? And in terms of the academic definition, like what it should mean, doesn't really seem to mean how we use it in culture, because there is so much emotion behind it. There is so much, people kind of use a caveat of, I don't want to get political, or I don't want to make this political, because that seems like a negative thing. Or people get criticized for politicizing something that shouldn't have been politicized. And typically that has a very negative kind of emotional connotation. But when you think about the definition, I think you had like just a very simple, like clear one. What did you write down for the definition of politics?
Yeah, I just think, I think I took this from Webster.
Yeah.
Pretty in depth here,
Yep.
but, relating to government or public affairs of a county. So it's just, I think at a very, very simple, like, hey, let's start the discussion. It's when we're talking about that, talking about things that are going on in our country, political things, talking about, local politics, like here's my opinion, here's my views, that's political. But I do think very much, as you were saying, there's a whole nother side to that coin, the academic side, but then there's the side that makes all of us really nervous.
Yeah. And why do you think that is? Why do you think it's so emotionally charged, hits deep for people?
Well, I think there's probably many spokes on that wheel of the answer to that question, but I think one of those is I do think it's kind of like money. That Jesus was brilliant at money because he understood it, and he I've said this before, but his number one competition for our heart, for our security, for our passions, for our trust was money, and he says that in Matthew 6. And, money, I think we get so emotionally attached to because so much of our identity is found there. Like, hey, the more I have, like, look at me. I finally feel like I'm enough. I finally feel like I matter. I feel like our security's tied up in there. Like, hey, I'll be taken care of. And there's some really practical sides to that. But then when you talk about it, you poke on it, you challenge people to think differently with money. It's like, oh my gosh, you're hitting on my heart issue. And I think politics for a lot fall in that same category to, this is my security. This is my future. This is going to impact my pocketbook. This is going to impact my kids. This is going to impact, what I'm putting my hope in. So you mess with that, gets emotional. And so it's not so much just this idea to go, hey, hey, we're having a conversation about our local communities or counties or the U.S. government. Yeah, I think it's like, no, this is much more. It's tied to our hearts, and that's why you see people give tons of money to political movements and those kind of things. So I think that's an aspect. I don't think that's in total, but that's an aspect of the answer. Yeah,
well, it feels like you're hitting on something because we were even talking about how, generally speaking, so looking at the population as a whole, it seems that a lot of times there's a disproportionate like emotional energy to, who is in office or a policy or whatever it might be. And I want to say that very carefully. I'm not in any way trying to say people's lives aren't affected, by her leaders or policies, because they totally are. But in generalities, a lot of times we do look like, man, every aspect of my life is going to change. Like all of my freedoms are going to be taken away, or all of them are going to be given back to me, or whatever it might be, which typically is not the case historically when you look at, what party is in control or whatever it might be. So it makes sense to me that as you're saying that there's something there, there's some tie to our identity that we're putting even more stock into it that perhaps, is healthier and makes sense. So that's part of the reason I think it's just such an interesting conversation that we're having. But in light of that, so kind of like given that, definition of political or perspective of political, how would you start to unpack the question of, is Jesus political?
Goodness. Well, I would just start off by just first saying that there's books written, there's individuals, men, women, far smarter than me who've written on this topic. And what you'll find when you Google or go to Amazon or what have you is that there's a lot of opinions. So I think that's, to start off, my opinion is just one of many, and this is Buck's opinion. So that's one. I think another way to answer that question is from, perhaps maybe the way we think about it, like, or maybe at a very basic level, like, did he, have his political slogans and, did he, advertise in the local, Jerusalem paper and, what was he tweeting on the rocks, those kind of things. That was not him.
Right.
All those things didn't happen. But in terms of, was Jesus like engaged in the political climate of his day? I think absolutely yes. I mean, he was all over the place. I mean, or he was all over that conversation. I think, from the context and the culture is really important to understand. Like the religious leaders in his day and where he predominantly focused in a Jewish context, I mean, that was like Pharisees, Sadducees, the scribes, everybody. That was like their political system. And then they were oppressed by Rome. And so, Jesus was constantly engaged with the Pharisees and Sadducees and speaking some pretty hard things against them. Jesus was also extraordinarily comfortable allowing tax collectors to come into his presence. In fact, Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, he said, "Come change the world with me." And a tax collector was such a political symbol in the first century context because a tax collector represented Rome, the Roman government, the empire that was oppressing Israel. And to have a tax collector decide with one or guilt by association was like you were saying, hey, I support Rome, taxing fellow Jewish brothers and sisters. And Jesus was really comfortable with all that. So, guilt by association, guilt by things he said. I think one of the things, really famous passage is, and I think it's like Mark 12, where he goes, the religious leaders try to get him to get political and like, hey, lean in deep and like kind of put yourself in a corner. So they're trying to trap him. They're like, hey, should we pay taxes? Which I think is a relevant question today. I mean, I think there's some religious people who go, I'm philosophically against taxes, which I find it hard to believe because I'm like, Jesus was really clear on this.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, he said what he said, because it'd be great if he said, don't pay taxes. I'd be like, yes. But in, Mark 12, he was like, hey, should they pay taxes or not? And he was brilliant. He was so brilliant because he could see through what they were doing. And he said, hey, give me a coin.
It's the only time Jesus asked for money, as far as we know.
That's as far as we know.
And we think he probably gave it back, but we're not sure. So
yeah,
I'm
guessing. I mean, that'd be weird. Like now they know him. Like, man, this guy was brilliant, but he's also a thief.
Yeah,
I mean, that would be weird if he took it. But I mean, he takes the coin, and I wrote this down because inscribed on the coin in the first century, I think this is interesting. It says, "Tiberius King, son of the god Augustus Maximus, high priest." So, like on the actual coin he had, that's what it said, and they were saying because the emperor, he thinks he's God. So, like there was an additional wrinkle into this, and so Jesus responds. He says, "Hey, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and then give to God what belongs to God." And there is such a opportunity to go like, wow, okay, the things of this earth, the things that are going to perish, the things that are, finite, like, hey, fine, pay your taxes. So that should clear up one issue. We should pay our taxes. Yep. Unfortunately, but, there's a lot of good reasons as to why. Then he says, render to God what's God. And, what's so cool to think about, and we could do a whole podcast on this, is the image of God is you. The image of God is me. We are made in the image of God. Yep. So like our lives belong to God. Our devotion belongs to God. All of us belongs to God. And so it was like Jesus in this subtle way was like, don't forget all of your hope, all of your identity, all of your security. Don't put it in this world and render that to Caesar. Render your money. That's fine. But render your life to God. And I'm like, wow. So much to be said on that, but that was a political statement. And then, he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, which we hear that and we're like, why does that have political implications? It was huge. And they were, the words they were saying, Hosanna, and, that he is the promised one, like you're the king of all kings. It was a huge political statement. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of examples to where Jesus was constantly wading into politics and kind of the political climate. But he managed that really well.
Yeah.
I mean, he part of what Jesus is doing is saying, he said this to Pilate. So this is interesting with Pilate. So he's arrested, standing before Pilate. Pilate represents Rome because Israel could not crucify him, so Rome had to crucify Jesus. He's standing before Pilate, and Pilate's like, "Hey, I have the authority to do all these things." And then Jesus says, "Do you know who gave you that authority? It didn't come from you thinking like your abilities. It came from God. Like God put you in this position." And which is a wild to think about in terms of implications. And then Pilate asks, "Oh, I hear you're a king," or something to this effect. And he's like, "Yes." And he goes, "My kingdom is not of this world. And in fact, if I wanted to do something about my current predicament, I could call on my servants, kind of this legion of my kingdom." And so I think it's really interesting that Jesus was constantly trying to introduce us and the world to his kingdom. So that, like, he is the king of all kings. One day he promises that kingdom will be established. It will be a one world government under Jesus, and he is the king of that. And this is what he kept trying to pull us to. But he entered into this world of these man-made governments and all these kind of things. And
well, even the fact that he uses the word king. I mean, you and I were talking about that. I mean, there's so many ways he could have, used an illustration for us, but the use of the word king, I mean, in that culture, that's as political as it gets to, use that kind of imagery for people.
Yeah, instead of like family of God or community of God, or he said, no, this is the kingdom. It's a very political term. So, the more you jump into who Jesus is, how he interacted with people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and so on, the religious leaders, how he interacted with Pilate, which was a fascinating discussion, how Paul, the Apostle Paul, who is inspired by the very Spirit of God, writes about governments. I think he's pretty political.
I love the story that you shared as well about the coin. I remember when I was in college, I went to Texas A&M with my buddy, Jared, and the only sad part about the story is that it took place at Texas A&M, unfortunately.
That's a little sad.
Are
you okay still?
Have
you processed that, unhitched from that?
It's so funny. I didn't go into A&M with, I took a college visit to A&M, open-minded, Yeah. Because I had, grown up an Ohio State fan, because I grew up in Cleveland, and so I was, kind of annoyed by all the Texas people, and everybody's a Longhorn, and I wanted to like A&M. I just hated everything about it.
Wow. Okay.
So, love the people there.
Sure.
Just don't like Brown.
People are great.
Just the buildings. Anyways, we talked about Ravi a lot last week, and saw Ravi Zacharias in person at the Texas A&M campus, and he shared that, and I've seen it, a bunch on YouTube and stuff since, but he shared in person a story of that coin and talked about how you could actually tell how inauthentic that guy's question was to say, should we pay taxes? He really was just trying to trap Jesus, because if he had been authentic in his response, he would have had a follow-up question when Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. He would have said, well, what belongs to God? And Jesus' response in all likelihood would have been, well, whose image is on you? That would have been the confirmation of, just like you were talking about, that alluding to something greater, which is so interesting, because he maintained this responsibility, in culture, this responsibility in the community he was in the political system he was in, to be engaged, to be informed, but then always maintain this perspective. And it was the balance of these two that seemed to make him so unique and so effective and so different within that system. So in light of the answer, so it sounds like a resounding yes to the question.
I would say he was, but there's the caveat of he was so brilliant at balancing the whole idea to go, next time you read about Jesus, look at how many times he talked about my kingdom, my kingdom, the kingdom of God, my kingdom. And he referred to that so much because he was trying to introduce us to a kingdom above this kingdom. This is why Paul says in Colossians 3, set your mind, set your hearts on things above. This is the idea to go, and we've talked about this is why Paul could say, for me to live is Christ, but to die is gain, because he knew there was a kingdom to come. And so Jesus was great at handling that tension and keeping his kingdom in perspective, but also he was very much engaged in the political issues of his day.
So if that's how he modeled it, then if it's a yes with a caveat, but if that's the way we see him model it,
sure.
Then what is our responsibility watching the example that he laid for us? If you're a follower of Christ, specifically, what would you say is our responsibility when it comes to this conversation of politics and religion?
Yeah, I think I alluded a little bit on Sunday to this, but I think, and I said it at the very beginning of the message. I just said, I'm not suggesting that we should not be part of the process. I think as followers of Jesus Christ, we should be as responsible as ever before. I mean, we have such a unique opportunity to be part of a process that elects our leaders. And I think to know the issues, to be responsible, to know the policies, to know the legislation, to understand the why behind the what, I think I'm like, hey, giddy up as a follower of Christ when it comes to politics. Absolutely be engaged in the discussion, be involved in politics if you so choose, and that's what you feel God's called you to do. That's important, and that's what I want to make sure you hear really clearly. But at the same time, in terms of like, how do we wade into this discussion? What does that look like to voice our opinion? What does that look like to think about policies and at the end of the day, I think the foundation of all of that is the law of Christ. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, as followers of Christ, that's where we take our cues from. That's our marching orders. That's the epicenter of our life. That's like the engine that drives absolutely everything is the law of Christ. And that drives not only, our relationships, that drives not only how we handle our finances, that drives, not only our worldview, but that drives how we engage in this whole political conversation, especially with the division that we're currently in.
Yeah, and when I think about that to me was the part that was so helpful from Sunday's conversation, how you kind of had it at the bottom of that slide, and it's like, hey, this is what informs everything. This is what informs our conscience, our political persuasion, et cetera. How then, I think the way even historically at North One, how we kind of have summarized the law of Christ is it's really always the answer to the question of what does love require of me in any given scenario, any given situation or relationship or moral decision, whatever it might be. But that word love is interesting, especially in our culture, because we use it in so many different ways. We could say that we, love God or love Christ, and then you could say that you love a Whataburger patty melt, and you might say that you love your parents, and you love your boyfriend or girlfriend, and there's so many. You love naps. I mean, we use that word to express a lot of different things, and to some degree, it feels like it almost is like the answer to that question culturally might be, do what makes you happy, like that's the loving thing, or do what keeps peace for others or something. We're able to interpret or redefine love kind of to whatever we want it to be. And so part of this overtime conversation is now we have a little bit more room and space to dive into, well, how do you know how to apply that? Like, how do you know how to discover the answer to the question of what does love require of me? So how would you give some context if somebody's like, okay, that was compelling, I really want to rethink, I want to have that be the foundation. Where do I learn what it looks like to apply the answer to the question, what does love require of me? Yeah.
One of the things I said during the message, and I didn't expand on this, was the idea about the more that you spend time in the law of Christ, the more that you mature in the law of Christ, the more that you get context in the law of Christ, the more you dig into the law of Christ, then that gives you a gift of an informed conscience. And that then empowers you to make a stand politically or all these different things with whatever we feel. But the key to that is maturing, looking into, spending time, being intentional. And the best source to understand that is the scriptures, the Bible. And when you open the pages of the Bible, that's when you begin to discover the life of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the letters all about the life of Jesus. If you have a Bible with red letters, I think even digital Bibles have red letters. Yeah. Although I don't know, I think I mean, I use a software application that has all the commentaries and all that other stuff. But, I mean, you can read the words of Jesus. You can look at how he responded to different things. For example, like, when Jesus was faced with, the Samaritan woman at the well. And Samaritan in the first century context, like, they hated Jews, and Jews hated Samaritans. So pick whatever you want to in your mind in terms of two groups of people that hate one another. Not like, I think they're kind of mad. No, they hate one another. They couldn't even stand. They couldn't be in the same room. Like if a Jewish individual touched or brushed against a Samaritan, they would have to go through the cleaning process. They were unclean. I mean, that's how big of a deal it was. And Jesus walks up to the Samaritan woman, somebody radically different than him as a Jewish man, and engages with her in a discussion, values her life, gives her direction, listens to her story, and then encourages her to go tell her story to a whole, her whole village. And so many people are impacted. And so that's one little anecdote, but it's one example of like, okay, so There are people I disagree with. There are people who I have an emotional climate that's really high, and I don't know if I'd ever use the word like I hate, but there are people like that in my life. So what do? Well, Jesus engaged them conversationally. He discovered their story, heard about their life, spent time with them. Okay, so what does love require of me? Well, if I'm a hardcore liberal, that means I need to go maybe listen to a hardcore Republican and understand the why behind the what. And if I'm a hardcore Republican, that means maybe I can cross the aisle and spend time discovering their story, discovering their context. It's what I talked about on Sunday. Where you stand depends on where you sit. Everybody's got a perspective that informs their stance. So go discover that because that's what love would require of you. And don't be an antagonist against it and call somebody something less than a person, because Jesus gave his life for people. They have intrinsic worth and value. So as a result, that's what we should do. And there's so many examples. I mean, where Jesus looks at the woman caught in adultery and says, "Hey, I don't condemn you. Go leave your life of sin. Sin's a big deal, but I don't condemn you." Well, I mean, people sin against us all the time. Jesus on the cross, forgive them for they do not know what they do. Jesus' whole life was a representation of forgiveness of us for our sins. Okay, so what does love require of me? To forgive. And Paul even says it real clear in Colossians 3, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And so that's another example to go, the deeper I dig in, I don't feel like forgiving, I don't want to forgive, they're the ones who hurt me. I don't have the emotional capacity right now to do it. But when you spend time looking at the law of Christ, the person of Christ, and how he forgave you, and his compassion and his gentleness and ultimately his forgiveness, the longer you go there, the more you mature in that, it empowers you to do the things that love requires of you. And, there's a whole lot more examples I could dive into.
Sure.
But that's what I would say. I mean, it ultimately comes down to reading the Bible, making that an intentional part of your life, and looking at the life of Jesus Christ. And that's what gives you clarity on how to wade into a whole lot of polarizing, divided, hard, difficult conversations.
Right. Well, and this is why I love, so many times over, my years here at North Point, I have heard, you on a Sunday morning unpack a case for the reliability of the scriptures. And whether, people are into that or not, and the history of that or not, the science of that or not, it's so important to know that because everything rises and falls with that. And so certainly not everybody listening is going to say, I feel like the Bible's an authority in my life, or, that it's trustworthy to me.
Sure.
But the more, and that might be a starting point, if somebody's listening and they're like, well, I don't know how to make the law of Christ my foundation because I don't even know what I think about the Bible. That might be the practical application of all this, is to look into the trustworthiness of the scriptures. But if you're somebody who has decided they're trustworthy in my life, well, that changes everything because now you have your starting point. Now you have your foundation. And I think that's what's so cutting, especially, if you just start to bring up some of the most controversial subjects and you were to say, I'm going to dive into those and I'm not going to decide, my, pro-choice or pro-life stance based on my experience or my friends. I'm not going to decide where I stand or what I think should be done on racial injustice based on, what my friend, said, or what my professor said, or what, seems popular on social media, whatever it might be. I'm going to go to the law of Christ and I'm going to see the way that Jesus treated people, and I'm going to look at what he said, and I'm going to start there and let that inform my conscience and let that rise up. There's just so much in that. If we're willing to honestly do that, there's so much there that I think could be really unsettling, for people, and really freeing for people, and really powerful. That's why I love the order that you went in so much.
Yeah, and that's, at the end of the message on Sunday, that's what I tried to make that point as clearly as possible to go, okay, if you're self-aware of your stances politically, and you know where they came from, you have perspective. They came from my parents. I grew up in a home full of Democrats. I grew up in a home full of Republicans or Libertarians or whatever it is. Or the birthday party people. And I don't mean to mock it or anything. It's just fun. It's Kanye's party, and I made I don't know if I actually made fun of that. I think I actually celebrated his tagline.
Yeah.
Which I really like. Yeah. Hey, if we win, it's everybody's birthday.
Yeah.
So anyways, the point at the end is, if you look at the law of Christ and you understand your political views and where they come from, are you willing to change your political policies, your political positions and even your political candidate based off the person of Jesus Christ, the law of Christ. That's a big, big, big tension. Yeah. And, I've said this before on lots of Sundays. I mean, if he really is the Son of the living God, if he really gave his life for you, if he really is the way, the truth, and the life, which he said he was, then I think we can trust him with those things, even if they're emotionally not satisfying. And they go against maybe what our mamas taught us or our daddies taught us or our professor said, or as you went down that list. I mean, I think there's a lot of those. And so I think that gives us a lot of clarity, and it gives us, if Jesus really is the Savior of the world, then it gives us something to hold on to that's objective and real and truthful versus like, hey, when I was 20, I had this opinion, then I was 25, I had this opinion, then when I was 35, I had life experience, and, I had kids and family and da-da-da-da. Sure. And now all of a sudden my political, we have an opportunity to do that from a young age, to go just the law of Christ. Start there.
Yeah. Well, and I think I would clarify for people too that are listening, just in case you're wondering, is there an agenda? Is there something we're not saying? That is just the framework to help you get the priority right. We're not saying with that, hey, if you do that, we think you're going to land on one side of the aisle or the other. We're trying to push you towards one policy or other. We're just trying to give a helpful framework in all the chaos right now to say, hey, have you ever put the law of Christ as the priority?
Yeah, the epicenter.
Yeah, exactly. And then you go in that journey and you discover, and what does Jesus say, and you make your conclusions based on that.
But. And hopefully, just to reiterate your point, at the end of the message, I really emphasize this. I said, listen, when it comes to policy, platform, and legislation, we will have a lot of diversity in the church, and we should, because there is no perfect political party. There's no perfect political party that encompasses every single social, ethical point of the law of Christ. There's no perfect political party that embraces fully, has its starting point at the very law of Christ, and that drives all of their thinking, all of their policies. So if that's the case, then we should see diversity. And so hopefully, if you are listening, and if you're like, oh, man, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, these are my persuasions. And I mean, there should be a lot of liberty there. And we should be able to accept that and love one another unconditionally, because, again, the law of Christ loved us unconditionally in our differences. As followers of Christ, we should do the same.
Yeah. Even that would be a radical. If I wasn't allowed to answer, the reason why I'm pro or against this is because I'm a Democrat or because I'm a Republican. If that wasn't allowed to be the why or the answer, the reason is because the law of Christ. The reason is because I think what love requires of me is.
Yeah.
That would just be a radical shift in thinking for so many of us, and I think is so helpful and challenging at the same time. So, anything else at the end of the convo here that you had or you had jotted a note about that you wanted to add on?
No, I just think hopefully it's a fresh perspective. Hopefully it's just something that frees you from having to hold on to things of the past, or, I've always done it this way, or it's because my parents did it this way, or this is the way I was raised, or this is what I learned, from my professor in college. I think all those are relevant. Those are wonderful. Put all those in your thinking and keep those there. That's fine. But I think maybe a liberating, a freeing, a refreshing way to look at it is to go, but now my allegiance, as we talk to, my image is God. Yeah. I'm made in the image of God. And so what Jesus said when he was talking about the taxes, give to God what belongs to him. You belong to him. So all of my devotion, all of my worship, all of me belongs to him. And if that's the case, then when it comes to whatever in life, maybe the starting point is to look at the life of Christ, and the longer we spend there, it begins to inform a lot of what we think, a lot of our stances, a lot of how we engage conversations, how we love people. And Jesus was brilliant at it, and I think he offers a lot of hope for our future, to bring us together to create roads and bridges of healing in our culture that we desperately need right now.
I love that you use the word refreshing, because I think in our current cultural and political climate, that's what this series has felt like to me so far. So I'm grateful for your willingness to speak into really difficult conversations that are so emotional and are so heated, and just do it in a way that is, gentle and graceful and also honest at the same time. I think it's what people are looking for, and I think it's been so helpful whichever side of the aisle you happen to be on. And if you're listening today and you've missed part 1 or part 2, they're both up. I'd encourage you to catch up and watch them. And part 3, the conclusion of Red and Blue, is coming this Sunday, which I'm so excited about to see how this wraps. So thank you guys for tuning in today. Thanks for listening, and we will see you on the next podcast.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, guys.